Superhero fatigue is the biggest problem threatening the genre, and potentially bringing down Marvel and DC because people are tired of superheroes. Or at least that's what Forbes, The Hollywood Reporter, The New York Times, Variety, The Guardian, and all the major media outlets in the US are saying. According to these sites, superhero fatigue caused the recent box office bombs, like The Flash and Madame Web. This is what made Marvel movies no longer massive pop culture events, and is the reason why casual viewers and fans feel exhausted. People are burnt out on the genre. But all of this is a lie. Superhero fatigue doesn't exist, and today in Mr. Headcannon, we're gonna prove it. We'll break down these three arguments, and we'll also explain why these media outlets have been talking about fatigue since 2003, before Marvel and DC even thought about creating cinematic universes.
I did not know that.
The first argument is that fatigue caused poor box office numbers. Supposedly Madame Web, Quantumania, The Flash, The Marvels, and now Joker 2 failed because of fatigue. When they put it like that, it sounds convincing, because Quantumania made less money than the previous two Ant-Man movies. Joker 2 made less than half the money the first movie made in its opening weekend, and The Marvels made 82% less money than Captain Marvel. It also doesn't make sense that The Flash lost money. It was a multiverse crossover packed with cameos, just like Deadpool and Wolverine. The only explanation is that people are tired of superheroes, right? But fatigue has nothing to do with these movies flopping. People didn't like Quantumania. Captain Marvel only performed well because Marvel sold it as a teaser for Endgame. The Flash was part of a dead universe and starred a criminal. Joker 2 is a musical, had terrible reviews, and people hated it. And not even Sydney Sweeney dressed as a schoolgirl could save Madame Web.
It's webbin' time.
If people were tired of superheroes, how could X-Men 97 be such a hit on Disney+? How could No Way Home make $1.9 billion in 2021? How do you explain Deadpool and Wolverine crossing $1.3 billion, making it the second highest grossing movie of the year? It's now the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time, and made more than any X-Men movie produced by Fox. The first teaser was the most watched trailer in history. And there's more. The first episode of The Penguin had 5.3 million viewers in its first 4 days in the US alone, beating The Last of Us, Succession, and doubling the numbers of The Rings of Power. And if that's not enough, Across the Spider-Verse was the most profitable movie of last year, according to Deadline, beating blockbusters like Oppenheimer and Barbie.
Wow.
It's plain stupid to use The Marvels or Joker 2 as an example of superhero fatigue. That's like saying people were tired of superheroes in 2004, and that's why Catwoman was a huge failure. That movie flopped because it was hot garbage. The state of the genre had nothing to do with it. This argument would only make sense if the real blockbusters had bombed at the box office. If No Way Home had lost money, or if Deadpool and Wolverine hadn't crossed $1 billion, then we could say people don't want to go to the movies to watch superhero films. But that's not what's happening. The genre's numbers are still super strong, as long as the projects are good.
Is that clear?
The second argument is that Marvel movies are no longer the biggest events in pop culture, because casual audiences have turned their backs on superheroes. Maybe the most loyal fans still show up, but it seems like your cousin is more interested in watching Barbie, Inside Out, Avatar, or the latest video game adaptations, which are finally getting good. She's not as hooked on Marvel like she was when Infinity War and Endgame came out. Back then, everyone and their moms were talking about superheroes. But was it really that way? Let's look at the numbers. According to the internet, Marvel's Phase 3 was the peak of superhero cinema. This phase started in 2016 and ended in 2019, and had 11 movies that made a total of $13 billion. In technical terms, that's a gazillion dollars. The numbers between each movie vary, because Endgame made $2.7 billion, and Ant-Man and the Wasp made $622 million. But if you're willing to dive into the world of mathematics with me, you'll see that the average revenue for Phase 3 movies was $1.2 billion per project. This is completely nuts. No movie franchise had ever reached those numbers. In the span of 4 years, the MCU made more than Star Wars in its entire history. There were no Marvel releases in 2020 because of the pandemic, and in 2021, the multiverse saga began. So far, this new saga has had 11 movies in total, the same number as Phase 3, so it makes sense to compare them. The combined box office for the multiverse saga is $8.5 billion, giving us an average of $770 million per project. That's a little more than half of Phase 3's average. For any other franchise, these wouldn't be bad numbers, but the box office did drop significantly compared to Phase 3. That means people aren't flocking to theaters like before because of superhero fatigue. Well, nope, that's not the case. We need to remember that 3 of these 11 projects were released during the pandemic, with half the theaters closed, so obviously the box office numbers would be lower. Also, the reception of these movies wasn't as good as Phase 3. Love and Thunder was a bad joke. Wakanda Forever didn't have its lead actor. People didn't like Quantumania, and no one wanted to see the Marvels. On top of that, we have the rise of streaming. Also, Marvel didn't release any Avengers movie in this saga, and their 2 most important characters are retired. It was expected they would make less money than in Phase 3, and it also makes sense that the new movies aren't huge events, except for No Way Home and Deadpool and Wolverine. And I know what you're thinking. Guardians 3 is the best movie of the trilogy by far, but it made a bit less money than Guardians 2, even though everyone knows the third movie is better. If Guardians 3 had come out in 2019, it probably would have crossed $1 billion. And we can't ignore that Marvel didn't have any flops in Phase 3, but they've already had 5 in the multiverse saga. It must be because of fatigue, right? Hate to sound like a broken record, but nope, that's not the case. It was impossible for superheroes to maintain their 2019 popularity forever, because the genre works just like the Super Bowl. What? Every February, everyone in the US talks about football. The fan who watches several games a day, the one who goes to the stadium every week, the one who only follows their team, and even the people who aren't really interested in the sport, but want to see the halftime show, which is one of the biggest entertainment events in the world. This makes the Super Bowl break viewership records every year. This year's final reached 123.7 million viewers, which is insane for a local competition. But the next day, the ratings for the games dropped sharply. The people who weren't really into football went back to their normal lives, and they won't watch another game until the 2025 final. The ones who remain are the usual fans, the ones who always watch football. This happens every year. It would be ridiculous to say that football is in decline now because fewer people are watching the games than during the Super Bowl, because when the next final comes, the numbers will skyrocket again. It's the same with Marvel. Endgame was the equivalent to the Super Bowl, and Marvel made sure to sold it that way. They spent $200 million just on advertising. They haven't done anything like that since, because they're waiting for Doomsday and Secret Wars, which will be the next Super Bowl for the superhero genre. If those two movies don't get close to the numbers of Infinity War and Endgame, then we can talk about fatigue. But as of now, it makes no sense to talk about that. The third argument is that some people feel exhausted by superhero movies. They're literally fatigued. It's something you hear in conversations with your friends, online, waiting in line at the movies, and in every interview with an actor. Paul Dano, who played the Riddler, had to talk about fatigue. Joseph Quinn, who's going to play the Human Torch, also talked about fatigue. Even Agatha's director had to address fatigue, saying the show could survive it because it wasn't a classic superhero story.
I'm not gonna watch it.
But this is not fatigue. They're talking about saturation, which is not the same thing. According to our good old friend the dictionary, fatigue means you're tired of something. In this case, of watching superhero-related projects. Saturation, on the other hand, means you've reached the maximum of what you can consume of a thing. In other words, when you just can't watch any more superhero movies and shows because you don't have the time for it. Saturation is real because each year there's more and more content. When I debunked the previous argument, I mentioned the number of theatrical releases made by Marvel, which remains the same as before. But after Endgame, the MCU started releasing shows in Disney+. With an average of 3 shows per year, that's literally double the content than before, or even more, because these shows have at least 6 episodes, so there's a lot more hours of content. To top it off, these shows aren't starring important characters. I loved Moon Knight and Loki, but they're not Marvel's top characters, like Spider-Man, the X-Men, or the Fantastic Four. So these shows can feel like filler leading up to the next big event, the one we actually want to watch. And more often than not, their quality is questionable. I'm looking at you, Echo. Also, DC is making its own shows. Plus there's Invincible, The Boys, the spin-offs, the animated Batman show, the Umbrella Academy.
It's too much!
It's normal to feel saturated because there's so much superhero content. If you don't want to be watching shows every single day, you might feel like you're falling behind. But the real problem is quality. James Gunn explained this much better than I can. In an interview with Rolling Stone, he said this: "I think there is such a thing as fatigue, but it doesn't have anything to do with superheroes. It has to do with the kind of stories that get to be told. And if you lose your eye on the ball, which is character, we love Superman, we love Batman, we love Iron Man, because they're these incredible characters that we have in our hearts. The key is therefore pushing these characters and personal stories to the forefront, instead of just thinking about them as tools to create good action scenes. If it becomes just a bunch of nonsense on screen, it gets really boring. But I get fatigued by most spectacle films, by the grind of not having an emotionally grounded story. It doesn't have anything to do with whether they're superhero movies or not. If you don't have a story at the base of it, just watching things bash each other. No matter how clever those bashing moments are, no matter how clever the designs and the VFX are, it just gets fatiguing. And I think that's very, very real. There's no superhero fatigue. What we're suffering is saturation due to mediocre projects. Think about this. If the genre were in decline and about to take its last breath, why did James Gunn agree to be the president of a superhero movie studio? He's an amazing director who can work for any studio he wants, but he chose to join DC, which has been struggling badly, to run a cinematic universe for the next 10 years, at least. If the genre were dying, Gunn wouldn't have accepted this offer. He would have gone on to make other projects that would earn him more money and worldwide recognition.
That does make sense.
But wait, if fatigue doesn't exist, honest, why is everyone talking about it? There are two explanations for that. The first one is that some of these outlets are trying to boycott the superhero genre with these kinds of articles, hoping the genre will disappear and be replaced by a new genre they actually like, or that other kinds of movies, which are now overlooked, get more attention. That's why they've been complaining since the mid-2000s, when Spider-Man, the X-Men, and Nolan's Batman started dominating the box office and movie discussions. They saw the superhero wave coming and tried to stop it, unsuccessfully.
Justice.
The second explanation is that superheroes are still trending, and talking trash about the genre makes money. Even though phases 4 and 5 made less money than phase 3, the MCU is still the most successful franchise in movie history, so any news about Marvel is trending news. Ask yourself this: when was everybody talking about Scorsese? When Killers of the Flower Moon came out, or when he spoke out against Marvel? Which article gained the most clicks? The one where Deadline made an in-depth analysis of blockbuster earnings, or the one where Variety trashed Marvel, taking advantage of the fact that Jonathan Majors had been fired? What was James Cameron's most talked about interview of last year? The one where he explained how they made the effects for Avatar 2 and how they revolutionized the film industry, or the interview where he said superhero movies weren't cinema?
That is an excellent question.
I'm sure many of these media outlets and directors don't have an agenda against superhero movies. They're just taking advantage of the fact that superheroes are trending to make themselves trend by talking trash about the genre. It works out perfectly for them when a terrible superhero project comes out, but when we have good superhero projects, they go radio silent. Don't you think it's a bit strange that these headlines have disappeared in recent months? Could it be because X-Men 97, Deadpool, and Wolverine, and the Penguin are amazing, and it would be suicide to talk about superhero fatigue? But this doesn't mean the genre doesn't have problems. In recent years, Marvel and DC have focused a lot on the multiverse, and while some stories have been great, this concept has a ton of issues. Issues that not even Deadpool and Wolverine could solve. We talk about that in this video over here.
I'm not gonna watch it. I don't need to watch it.